As digital transformation has accelerated, so has the threat environment, and SecOps teams need a solution that connects these dots. Cyware understands. That's why we've built the only cyber fusion platform in the industry that brings next-generation SOAR and threat intelligence together, putting teams back in control of security operations. Connecting the dots across the security stack and has accelerated, analyst fatigue. So has the threat environment. Cyber fusion is the future of cyber threat response.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Josh Crandall from the First Events team. I'll be helping with host responsibilities on the webinar today. Before we get started, I would like to remind you, if you're interested in participating on our conference 2D Work Adventure platform, please make sure you're registered, and you can do so by visiting the conference website. This will give you access to speaker Q&A, networking, the exhibit hall, and other games and fun experiences. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to pass the mic over to our session moderator, Hank.
Hi to everyone throughout the world. My name is Hank, and I will be your moderator for this session. Let me introduce our first two speakers. Antti is working as Chief of Preparedness for the Association of Technology Industries of Finland, as well as being the General Secretary of DigiPool. Julia is the Information Policy Officer at the National Cybersecurity Center in Finland, also known as NCSC Finland. We are holding all Q&A immediately following this presentation in Work Adventure, so the floor is now over to our speakers.
Okay, thank you, Hank. I hope you can hear me, and I hope that you can also see my presentation now.
Yes, we see the presentation.
Thank you, great. Well, it's a privilege to be here, and we in Finland are especially proud of our current state of public-private partnership, and I'm here to give you an example of that through the exercise that we held during the last year. But firstly, how do I change the screen? Great. Firstly, I'll have to give you some background information. So who are we? As mentioned, my name is Antti Nyqvist, and I'm the Chief Secretary of DigiPool. DigiPool is essentially a network of companies which is dedicated to further preparedness and continuation planning in companies in Finland. We are part of the NESA, National Emergency Supply Agency's network of companies, and NESA again is government officials working under the Economic Affairs Ministry in Finland. And Julia.
Right, and good. Thank you, Antti. So good day from my behalf as well. My name is Julia Vainio, and I work at the Finnish Transport and Communications Agency, and more specifically at the National Cybersecurity Center. My work there includes cyber exercises coordinating. So we support and coordinate different types of cyber exercises on a national level and also on an international level. So today I will be talking about the NCSC's contribution to the Tieto20 public-private partnership exercise, and what were the key lessons learned from our side in this exercise. So nice to be here. Antti, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you. And what I forgot to mention is that I was also a project manager for this exercise, so therefore I'm more telling you about the arrangements, how we did it. Well, how did the Tieto exercise improve the public-private partnership here in Finland? We'll firstly give you some background information to kind of highlight on what were the participants, for example, in the exercise, and that way we can more clearly point out the facts, how we did it. Well, the Tieto exercises have a long background for over 22 years already and still counting. And essentially, it's a continuation that builds on top of the previous exercise every time over. Basically, the exercise is a scenario-based tabletop exercise, but it always has included a real-life role action playing game in the end of the exercise. And essentially, that is a valuable example of the successful private partnership through the participants that are involved in the exercise. Government officials, companies, all mixed together, working for a cyber crisis in order to solve it and in order to recover from it. Essentially, the exercise is a platform for developing and testing existing methods and existing plans on how to recover from such an incident. And what makes the exercise quite effective is the fact that it's been organized together with the Finnish broadcasting company, which is creating real-life news feeds into the exercise, but based on the imaginary news content that we have developed. Overall, the high-level goals for this exercise is to create prerequisites for the cooperation that exists in these vast networks of companies and government officials, and especially, of course, on cyber incidents, as mentioned. And we are aiming to develop the situational awareness in companies, but to build them capabilities and provide them information to enable better decision-making in past cyber incidents. And one essential part is also to induct them into the existing cooperation forums and structures which are in Finland nowadays and can support them survive the cyber crisis. And of course, we are trying to produce results that we can measure or follow up afterwards and see that they are developing and that the cooperation is being developed further. And one essential point is that the cyber development programs in Finland gain their topics from these kinds of exercises. So whatever we find in the exercise will be developed further in those programs. And for example, the NIS directive has been implemented in Finland so that we can exercise it, for example, in the Tieto 20 exercise that we held last year. So it's something we believe that is unique in the European level. And what does an organization gain by participating in the exercise? Well, first of all, everything we do in the exercise aims to the fact that we hope that the participants can update their plans or even their agreements based on the exercise or whatever findings they have there. We hope that they will start organizing their own cyber exercises in their own organization, and we hope that we can provide them information that gives them rationale to invest in the cyber security. Well, usually the cyber security is something that has been seen as a cost, and the direct feedback from the investments is not that obvious. So hopefully we can give rationale on how to recover from the incidents by saving, and that's usually means saving money in the process as well. And yes, the Tieto 20 exercise was more than just an exercise. It's more about the cooperation of the networks and companies. The Tieto exercises have been arranged every other year, and usually the focus changes from year to year in these exercises. And this time around, we focused on the food production, resale and delivery, and logistics related to those fields of industry. We had oil essentially there because it's needed in the logistics, and water because that is needed in the food production. And then we had the sector-specific officials involved from those fields of industry, such as the NIS reporting related officials. We also had the partner companies or the service providing companies that provide services to the first mentioned sectors, such as the telecom, ICT, and security, physical security protection providing companies, and the network and cooperation of all of these in one cyber crisis. And of course, then we had officials such as Julia involved in
right. Exactly. So what we wanted to do is to create kind of a mini simulation of a society, and by doing that effectively, we also had to have the information security officials incorporated in the exercise. So that's the reason why we had our center, NCSC, as well as members from the police force and other defense forces and such come together to organize this exercise. So they were both exercising there, helping the other participants, and also we were part of the planning process. So definitely a very comprehensive participation.
Yeah, then of course we had the bad guys there, the red team that was taking the game further and kind of directing the game through the pre-scheduled scenarios from the background work that we've done. And then we had the white team, which simulated the otherwise missing society of the exercise. The miniature society that we had here included almost all the needed parts there, but in case something was missing, such as the president of Finland, it was simulated by the white team, which was really interesting to see happen. About the profiles that participated from those companies, we had lots and lots of different organizations participating in the exercise from 10 fields of industry. And what was kind of the most important topic here is that it really wasn't a huge investment for the participants to join the exercise. We calculated that it was roughly around 10,000 working hours that was spent in participating in the exercise, and that really is an investment from the participants. And we hope that they feel that they gain something really by participating, since they made such an investment in it. Okay, and then to give you an example of the contents of the exercise, the schedule, we had to, of course, adjust that due to the COVID-19 crisis many times over, and this is kind of the final format of the schedule. Anyway, the most important notion here is that we had a couple of educational modules there that were providing information to the participants and educating them on various topics. And then we topped it up with the intensive phase camp, or the game that we were playing this January this year. And overall, we will have still a follow-up seminar upcoming later this autumn, to follow up on the subjects that were found during the exercise. And the content that we were educating the participants were about the hybrid influencing and about the crisis communications that is happening during the cyber crisis, or large or simultaneously happening cyber incidents. And one of the most important topics of the first day was the critical business process prioritization and system level prioritization that was educated to the participants, and hopefully they will start doing that in their organizations as well. The second phase during September was about the legislation which is to be considered in these kinds of cyber incidents. And then the government officials were dealing out their expectations towards companies and otherwise basically support and services that they are providing companies to survive these cyber incidents. For example, the police was dealing out information on how to report cybercrime and so on. And of course, the NCSC was educating companies on their services and the support that they are providing for the companies to survive this crisis. We were sharing information on the ISACs, information sharing and competence centers that are existing currently in Finland. And then, of course, information related to the NIS reporting, which is coming from the EU side. And then the most important topic was the model for major incident management and cooperation for these vast and large-scale cyber incidents. We had an additional information sharing session before the game phase of the exercise, and the educational content there was the pointing out of the roles and responsibilities of the crisis management team in a company, and basically the participants were adapting them into those roles. And then, of course, we went through the existing reporting methods such as real-life forms to report crime or GDPR or information security breaches to NCSC, and the NIST reporting that is happening. And perhaps an interesting topic is the fact that we shared also the imaginary news content in all of these phases through the broadcasts of the Finnish Broadcasting Company. And that kind of got the players into the mood of the exercise. And that takes us into the game and the scenarios that we were playing there. Firstly, the game is a non-technical game, which we were playing there, so it's an information sharing exercise overall. We were kind of dealing out different kinds of injects that were coming from the scenarios of the background story that was created for the exercise, and it was done to the participants via emails, phones, TV news, social media, or internet simulators, and software such as those. And that basically means that we can do this exercise remotely nowadays. It was a hybrid this time around, and most of the participants were participating remotely into the game phase of the exercise. The communication of the effects in this vast network was the most important topic, and exercising that, for example, using the ISAC information sharing groups throughout the game was an important point there. And overall, the participants had to rehearse giving interviews or giving press conferences publicly and sharing information through that way as well. The scenarios that we were playing there were basically 4 high-level scenarios, including many actors such as terrorist actors and even a couple of countries making their own agendas happen in the internet realm and affecting that way the participants and the game that was being played. Real live two-sided role-playing game that we used. So then it was time to play. The game in the module 3 that we were playing this January was, as mentioned, 3-day game, starting from the morning and ending at evening, a long day for every participant. We had to, of course, start the week by making preparations and making the first injects into the game so that they were halfway ready made, although we then left some room from improvisation and allowing the game to live its own life throughout the days. The important topic here was to share the information throughout the days between the different teams in the game, and that was done by doing the summaries of the day. It's an important point to share out, level out the information between the participants all over in the game. But even more important method for doing that was the ISAC group operational meetings that were held regularly within the days. That was the most important and most effective way of sharing information related to cyber crisis and dealing out the information which helps the companies in recovering from those incidents. And of course, we had a hot workshop in the end of the game and discussed the findings that we did with the exercise. And of course, the YLE was also involved throughout the days. It was keeping their own exercise at the same time with our exercise, and they were also participating in the game. And they even made some, in addition to making the news content, they were making IP-based broadcasting technology for the exercise, and they will be using that in the real-life crisis situations after the exercise as well. So it was really an important exercise for them as well. For over 50 persons were joining from the Finnish Broadcasting Company. Well, how will we follow up these topics? We, of course, had a hot workshop seminar right after the intensive phase. Basically, the companies were dealing out the information that, or sharing the information that they found in the exercise. and they basically gave promises on the topics that they will be developing in their own organizations. And then we will still be having a follow-up seminar later this autumn, where we can follow up on what things they've been able to take further, and whether there were any possible impediments in those topics. And of course, we will hear those presentations from the government officials as well, and how they will be supporting these topics. And then we will have the alumnus activities within the whole network that is unique here in Finland, and we will of course take the topics further through those networks as well. So how was the NCSC's participation in the Tieto 20 exercise, Julia?
Right, thanks. So we wanted to take a very comprehensive approach to this exercise and its planning in all phases, because it is a very important exercise, not only on a national level, but also for the NCSC to both perform well as an organization, as well as help other organizations play and test their processes as best they can. So we had this kind of plan, do, check, act type of way that I will present what we did to you guys. So plan to succeed, first of all. Like I said, we wanted to have a very comprehensive approach to this. So we were involved in the entire life cycle of Tieto 20, so the exercise. We had a member or members in the planning team, coordination team, blue team, red team, white team. So we were all over the exercise scenario writings and activities. And of course, we had our own post-exercise evaluation, so we could gather all the good insight that we got and then develop that further. Some of the best practices that we had in terms of this comprehensive approach were that we, by doing this, we were able to influence the tools and devices used in the TTX, and that was a very good insight. So even though they weren't the ones that we use in our day-to-day life, there were possibilities to make them appear closer to those that we do use. Another best practice was that we were able to influence the scenario and injects. Like Antti said, there were many different types of scenarios and injects. So by being present and having our say in it, we were able to kind of create a more realistic worldview, as well as have our say in how we would want to exercise ourselves. And then the third best practice was definitely a two-way communication channel of wants and needs between Digipool and NCSC. So we thought it was very valuable for us to keep direct communications throughout the life cycle. If you could put the next slide, please. Thank you. So on the do phase, like Antti mentioned a few times, there were these ISACs that we used and that we currently use in real life as well. So information sharing and analysis centers. So this was an integral part of Tieto 20's goal of enhancing this type of network cooperation and the public-private partnerships that we essentially wanted to practice in the exercise. So we had different ISACs for foodstuff, logistics, water, media, and so on. And our blue team had very specifically predefined roles for each player. So whether they were not solely, but mainly responsible for incident response, or whether they were mainly responsible for ISAC coordination responsibility. So in that sense, it was emulated the reality in a really nice way, and we were able to get some good insight into how those ISACs worked during the exercise and what could be improved. Next slide, please. And then the other part of our play or our simulation was the incident handling. So we had ISACs and incident handling for our blue team. And in our blue team, we had 5 CERT players who received around 200 tickets and emails during the 3-day TTX. And on the right side, you can see a blurry picture of what the incident handling tool looked like. So that picture isn't finished, don't worry about that. And it does not replicate the real incident handling procedure that we have, but it was a good simulation of that. So what we really needed to do to handle both the ISACs and the incident, the tickets, was that we needed to have a goal-oriented mindset. So one was the internal goal setting, what we want to exercise as an NCSC participating, and the other one was external goal setting. So what how can we best steer the other players into the right direction? And here, one of the best practices was to have an active, have an active white team member to steer the blue team to a right direction. So finding the signal from the noise and how to best serve those players. And next slide, please. And one of the things that we really found interesting was the model for major incident management. So this is something that we've been in the process of developing for quite some time at the NCSC. And now we found a way to practice and exercise that in Theatre 20. And when we tested that model in a kind of a controlled test laboratory, we found very good and valuable insights into what we can do to better enhance it moving forward. And it's a definite tool for public-private partnership going on in the future. And we noticed that there's a lot of demand for such similar models for private sector critical infrastructure providers. So this was definitely one of the insights and the ACT parts of what we could say the lessons learned. So now we have a 2-minute warning. I think we need to move on, Antti. And lessons learned. And please, could you put the next slide on, please? Thank you.
Well, surely about the organizing such an exercise, it's really an essential to select the target sectors and the sector companies early on in the process and start to make the stakeholder communications really required for that. The most important work was perhaps the background story creation and even selecting the everyday tools in the use of the exercise. And as mentioned, we are moving towards that we should be using the tools that we are using in the everyday life in these exercises. And we have to reserve time and time again to induct the participants, even especially within these kind of long exercises that we had due to COVID-19 crisis. And of course, the networking part is something that we will still be having in the future because the COVID prevented that so far. About key findings, you had a couple, Julia.
Yes, I think we will need to save most of them for our speakers Q&A later on, but you can read the summary of our key findings here. So we had ISAC groups and the model for major incident management from NCSC's side, which were terribly useful, and we will definitely enhance them in the future.
Yeah, and we found out many topics that we will be improving in the future, and based on the feedback, the participants felt that it was really a useful exercise.
Absolutely.
And we will be developing that further in the Theatre 22 exercise, and we will be aiming for international cooperation there as well. Thank you, and see you in Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you for that great presentation from Finland. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is, I've known Chen for the past 3 years, where he manages the Cyber Operations and Incident Response Unit in the Israel National Cyber Directorate. I'll remind everyone again, Q&A is available via Work Adventure. Chen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you and see you. Now you just have to share your screen.
Yeah. Right now.
And we see your screen. Okay, floor is yours. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Hank. It's nice to see you again. So I will try to explain to you, to describe a nice incident that we handled just recently. And I will try to explain during the next 30 minutes or so on the reasons that we act, how we act, what we do, and maybe how we do it, mainly on the tactic level of how we investigate and what are the reasons that we investigate certain incidents. And on the other hand is what we do that in a nation level and how we mitigate such an incident. So Just a quick intro. I've been a part in the business, cybersecurity business for the last 20 years, private sector, government sector, and national security agencies. I've been all around doing regulatory work and other jobs all over. In the last almost 4 years, I've been part of the incident response and cyber operation. I'm actually leading that group within the INCD, and all the operative incidents that we're handling are under my responsibility. So INCD is actually holding a 24/7, 365 days call center, which actually serves as a first aid for any organization in Israel that wants to have help regarding any incident that he's having or he's suspecting of having. So everyone can call that hotline, receive a human answer. You can send email as well, and get help or first aid help. There are different kinds of methods that we help organizations. Some of them are just offering a playbook. Some of them are asking them to go to the private sector and ask help from another company. It depends on the situation. It depends on our specialty and our added value that we can offer. So our incident starts on August 31st, when we get 3 calls from different organizations regarding a suspicious email, potentially a malicious email that the same retailer, electronics retailer, has sent to them. One of them was stopped with the mail relay or email defense system, and some of them actually managed to get through. Now, that is not uncommon within INCD. And just to give you a taste of what we're handling, there are roughly 1,312 phishing events that we receive a year. Now, remind you, 2020, Corona year, we are all handling different kind of situation. And once we expected, maybe hoped that the cyber incidents will be, the amount will be descending, we found out that it actually got a bit worse. So no one actually thought that would be the consequence. But during the 3 months of July, August, and September, which is around the time of this incident, we found an increase of the phishing incidents that were reported to us. The challenge is, what do we do with such a number? It's very hard to investigate and perform a forensic investigation on each and every one of them. Our call center, our 119, which offers the first aid, performs initial checks, and through that, we understand and decide how we operate around that incident. Now, in order to understand better what is the damage potential from that indication, from that electronics retailer, we performed a web-in check around that organization. We found some interesting information which was actually available to everyone. We found that it is working with critical infrastructure organization. It was working with government offices. It was working with almost every sector of the public sector within Israel. So I can only assume that you will agree with me that it needs special attention from INCD. That is what we thought, and we decided that we need to perform a deeper investigation and actually give special resources to that organization. From that moment, we decided to send a field manager, one of our guys, directly to that organization. That is one of the methods that we work in order to gather more information. Now, that is very challenging for a government office to call a private company and say, hi, this is the INCD. We want to interest you in some information that we have. We got reports of something that may be happening within your network, and that is very challenging for them to accept that as something for their own beneficial, and is a part of our job to try and convince them and to let them understand a little bit better that what we do and how we do it. We work with full cooperation and with almost always complete transparent activities with the organization, and we offer our services not only to investigate the organization in order to remove the threat from that specific network, but in order to gather what is needed in order to share the information to the other, to the whole public sector within Israel, the industries, government, everyone who is a part of our mailing list, and etc. So at that point, we actually contact that organization, and to our surprise, we got full cooperation, and we started performing our first activities within the organization's network. Okay, that was on the September 1st. We are now conducting our investigation and managing to find some indications of first activity starting February 2020. That means around 7 months of the attacker doing whatever he wants within that organization. And I will show you a few things that we found. As you can see and guess, there's a huge activity within that network, but we'll try to give you some examples of things that we found. First of all, the initial access vector was using two vulnerabilities, public vulnerabilities that everyone knew. But the most important thing for us was to find that the release date was February 11. And the player that actually got access to that organization did this 2 or 3 days after the release of that vulnerability, after the release of the RCE. This was very worrying for us, and that was very quick relatively to other things that we've seen. And it was very interesting to see that and understand what he was looking for. Of course, that made us very alert to all the other vulnerabilities and trying to find mechanism on how to find other organizations that were attacked by that specific vulnerability, and I will explain a little bit later. So a little bit on what he did there. So we've seen him use the vulnerability, gain access, running Mimikatz in order to gather whatever is needed from that directory. We've seen him use open source web shell in order to gain persistence and schedule tasks which run on a weekly basis. We've seen them even try to get to other customers of that organization. And one of the things that we've seen is remember the emails that they sent through that organization. So we investigated a little bit on that, and we've seen the process of that work. Now, the interesting thing about this is, I know you can't, most of you can't read Hebrew, but I can assure you, this is very good Hebrew, and I can assure you that the guy who did this is not a native Hebrew speaker. I can sign on that. Now, one other thing that is very interesting, remember I said he was there for 7 months. This email was actually part of a business process that was made with one of the customers, and he was actually replying a message with a very legit syntax that says that actually continued the conversation and persuaded the victim to open the link. Now, once it opened the link, a zip file was downloaded. From there, 2 things happened. First, registration with the canary token, and the other one is the payload, which actually contained the malware itself, which actually allowed the attacker to do whatever he wanted in there. One thing that was very strange for us, once the file, the payload was activated, there was a Windows Defender Summary fake alert on that client that said, don't worry, everything is okay, please continue your work and everything will be all right. Now, that's one method that we've seen actually happen. The other method was just sending the URL, directly the URL without an attachment. The URL will open the same info docx with the registration to the canary token, and from there a payload with the same issues and the same method transmitting to a C2 server, and from there everything was free. The attacker was free to work. The interesting thing about this method is once sorry, about the previous method, once the attacker opened the attachment, what he saw was a legit document that was relevant to that specific business process, and that specific document was part of the attack itself. So we found it very interesting to see the relevance that the attacker made to the specific business process of the organization. Sorry about that, just a second. Okay, so we've seen the initial access, we've seen the mimikatz, we've identified the web shells and the scheduled task. We created a heat map of the organization of where the attacker got access to, where he left his persistence, and we managed to clear that, to clear all that. On top of that, as we all know, once you clean and remove the threat, you have to do some defense actions in order to make sure he won't come back. So the organization got recommendations from us to actually prevent the return of that specific attacker. He managed to patch the VPN, patch the Exchange server, put a MFA on the users connecting from remote access, and change all the passwords within the organization, which, as we all know, is not that easy to do on a live and operational organization. But as he understood the threat, as he understood the potential of losing his business, he stopped everything and actually did that. As part of our methodology, we've seen attackers get back to the same organizations because they are very interested in what's going on over there, in how they can continue, because they found a good thing. They've been there for 7 months. They want to return once they're kicked out of the organization. So we leave our monitoring equipment there. And one thing we see is on September 15, the attacker returns to the network and gains full control over everything that is left there. Domain admin, mimikatz, schedule task, all over again with all the power that he needed and full access again. We were, let's call it, we were surprised of the quick ability for him to get back to that organization. What we found out, once we tracked that back, we found something very interesting. Through the business process of that organization, they're using remote control applications. Some of them they use, and some of the ones you see here, they do not use. The player itself, the attacker, installed remote control on the developers' computers, their PCs, and without them noticing, he created users, specific users, and managed to get back there. By the way, At the start of our investigation, we asked whether they know this kind of remote control applications, and we indicated them to the organization, and they didn't have a clue, so they didn't want to remove them. Interesting. Of course, once we found that and we managed to investigate that, the organization removed the remote control application. He changed again all the passwords with all the meaning of that regarding the business logic. He reduced the remote control software to 1, and now he's working only with that application. Now, in order to understand a little bit better this incident, first of all, as I mentioned before, INCD is conducting forensic investigation in an organization in order to extract whatever is needed, the indications of that attack, and share them quickly and widely as possible. In this case, we issued a TLP-wide alert, which has all the information regarding the TTPs, regarding what he did, how he did it, when he did it, and with some, of course, examples. Not only did we do that, we actually shared over 300 indicators that are relevant to that attack. That's a lot to one campaign. I'm sorry. Now, if you want to know how we share our information, because that's very important for us to actually expose that, we have a specific portal that is called Cybernet, which actually connects all sorts of organizations, CISOs, SOCs, several security companies within Israel that are part of this community. And that platform allows us to share quickly, very quickly, almost directly to the security devices of several organizations, indicators that may be, not maybe, but there are malicious, that we can sign that they are malicious. So we issued a quick TLP-wide alert in order to protect our public sector and in order to receive feedback on whether or not they identified even more activities as such that were described in our alert. So, on top of that, of course, we issued a report to the retailer describing exactly what we did, how we did it, and what we did within the organization, including all the findings that we got. And from there, we moved on. Our investigation showed 3 distributors, 3 main distributors that were actually part of that campaign. All the distributors were exploited by the same method, the exchange vulnerabilities. They were used in order to spread the spear phishing emails. They were at that point the same method, very oriented to the victim, with very convincing method in order to click whatever they wanted them to click. And we've seen them use all sorts of recipients, as you can see, a small amount of recipients to a large number of addresses that were actually the victims. These 3 distributors were investigated by us, and we've seen them. Once we've seen the first one, we managed to find the same actor on the same on the other distributor with the same tools and the same method. So it was very easy and very quick to understand. Now, just to tell you on another action that we took regarding the mitigation of that attack on a national scale. Once we discovered the 2 vulnerabilities were exploited, we have a special team that is in charge of scanning the entire Israeli cyber surface and trying to detect organizations that are vulnerable. They use all the tools that you can imagine, Shodan and some other tools that are actually self-developed. And through those tools, they managed to create a list, a huge list of organizations that are vulnerable to those vulnerabilities, trying to understand which of the organizations are behind those IP addresses and contacting them specifically. Our national CERT, our 119 call center actually calls each and every company and make sure first they know that they are vulnerable. Second, make sure they close and update whatever it is needed to be updated. It's those vulnerabilities and others on the same time. So once we discovered the three distributors, once we handled that, we managed to create a whole map of everything that happened. What we've seen is that by mid-October, which is around, let's say, 6 weeks from when we started the initial investigation, the first investigation of the electronic retailer, we've seen 167 organizations that were hit by that campaign. And by hit, I mean not only that they got the specific mail with a specific attachment or link, but they opened it. Some of them were blocked, some of them were not blocked. Most of them were not identified by any defense mechanism, and we were very worried that this might spread to other organizations and the numbers will multiply. Finding more distributors were one of our worries. We did not find any more distributors, and let's say that by the start of November, we managed to contain the entire campaign and make sure that all the proper antivirus companies, security companies would sign and make sure that they know all the indications that we had. All the IOCs were shared with them as well in order to deal with that in a wider matter. There are some questions that are left open regarding the specific campaign. It was very wide on a large amount of different sectors that we did not understand why or how or when. Some insights regarding the incident itself. We found that having a call center which is accessible to the public sector is very, very, very effective in our role as a national cybersecurity actor. Part of our role is to defend and to mitigate and probably as much as we can prevent cyber incidents as the one that I described here from happening within the Israel cyber arena. Normally, the indication comes from the organization where they are, let's say, aware enough to raise the flag, call us and say, listen, I suspect something. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of false positive and it takes a lot of resources to handle that, but we try to develop the methodology, the understanding from our experience on how to find the specific ones that can allow us to identify as quickly as we can and as effectively as we can the potential pandemia within our arena. So we see huge advantage in working with the public sector. We understand that it is the most important player within our ability to handle such incidents, and as part of the general director agenda, we are going to extend the cooperation and collaboration with the public sector exactly and specifically to prevent these kinds of events of happening within our nation.
3-minute warning, Ken. 3-minute warning.
Yeah. So I'm actually pretty done. As of now, everything is actually not so quiet within our cyber incident arena, but the specific campaign is no longer working within our arena as far as we know, of course. And that's it for me, Hank.
Excellent presentation. I truly enjoyed it. I hope that everyone else did. And hopefully one day we will all be able to see each other physically and not do it via this cyber platform. But everyone should go to the work adventure and basically put in their questions to Chen there. And we now will be signing off to the next session. So everyone, goodbye, and thank you for participating.
All right, thank you, everyone. We are going into a 15-minute break. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And thank you again for joining us. Next up, we have Daniel Woods. Daniel researches the economics of security and privacy with a recent research on risk quantifications, cyber insurance, and online consent. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Daniel.
Cool. Great. So I will just share my screen. Cool. Yeah, so I'm Daniel Woods, and today I will be speaking to you all about incident response as a lawyer's service. So this is about kind of the economic and business structure surrounding how incident response is carried out. And I will try to touch on kind of how that flows through into the technical implications of how incident response is carried out. But just to kind of flag up front, this is a non-technical talk about kind of, the business structure surrounding incident response. Now, this title kind of tries to invoke this populist idea that, lawyers might be taking over incident response. And of course, that's a provocative title, kind of, intended to produce discussion, and there's more nuance than that. Equally, this talk could have been called How Cyber Insurance Shapes Incident Response. So I will present the slides, and then I look forward to discussing this with you because this is a very practitioner-focused talk. So this whole research project actually started with this tweet by Pierre, where he is expressing concern that incident response, or at least who carries out incident response, is being determined by cyber insurance. And I have, in my PhD, investigated the cyber insurance market. So I had a rough idea of how this might be working, but then I kind of embarked on this research project trying to understand how this works. How does cyber insurance shape incident response? And this used a variety of methods, but in particular, expert interviews where I spoke to people in this ecosystem. And one thing that really emerged is it's not just that cyber insurance kind of influences which IR firms are selected. Actually, there's this additional actor, breach coaches, they're lawyers, depending how you call them, external counsel. They are also playing a really big role in incident response. So that is how that kind of provides the motivation for this talk. And we break the talk down into 3 sections. So first, I would like to sketch to you what incident response as a lawyer's service looks like. Then I would like to kind of look into why it's coming about now, because this actually has quite a significant break from how incident response was carried out, or at least planned traditionally. So the middle section looks at what is driving this shift, and we basically identify 2 issues. First is litigation risk, and the second is cyber insurance. And then the final section of this talk will try to, kind of pull apart the future-looking aspects. Cool. So to understand hotline incident response, it's useful to think about a victim firm, and they suffer an incident. And here, when we use incident, we kind of mean incidents that are interesting to the board. So we're not talking about incidents in the sense of the security policy has been violated, say there's an authentication failure. No, this is things like ransomware, data breach, business email compromise. So the way hotline incident response works out is upon discovering this incident, the victim firm immediately calls external counsel and delegates all responsibility to external counsel. I'm just going to take a brief check that sound is okay. I think it is. Cool. So everything gets delegated to external counsel. And then actually it is, external counsel who decide what happens next. So they hire a technical person to go into the system and investigate the cause of the incident, the scope of the incident. But in addition, external counsel control maybe of public relations, professionals are kind of brought in to help communicate externally. I know Jason Nurse gave a talk about this earlier in the conference, or they might also hire logistics firms to help with, say, credit monitoring, or also, say, notifying individuals, things like printing letters, sending letters, which actually become a big logistical problem with the scale of data breaches. They will also advise or potentially liaise with law enforcement and regulators. So the important aspect of this slide is that you see lawyers are at the center of breach response. So to invoke a kind of American sports analogy, lawyers are acting as the breach coach, sorry, the quarterback of incident response. They're deciding who gets brought in and whether they get brought in. But a separate way of looking at the difference between kind of hotline incident response and traditional incident response is to look at the timeline. And this really kind of highlights the contrast. So in conventional incident response, it always begins with the planning before an incident has even occurred. So the organization writes the incident response plan that delegates responsibilities. It may also set up monitoring infrastructure to continually monitor the network. And it puts a plan in place. What happens when an incident is detected? How are decisions kind of elevated through the hierarchy? Yeah, so the point here is that conventional incident response always had this ex ante aspect. And I think an important thing to consider here is that actually requires a lot of information security maturity. The organization needs to appreciate that cybersecurity is a risk that may threaten their organization and to put this plan in place. Whereas that's potentially less true for hotline incident response. So here we kind of contrast that hotline incident response begins when the incident has been detected. So the victim firm says, oh, we have, say, a ransomware incident, or perhaps someone else notifies them that they've been compromised. And then it begins when the breach coach is hired. So they call a breach coach, set up a contract, and then it kind of all unfolds from there. And a second difference that's maybe worth emphasizing is hotline incident response is driven by litigation risk. So the lawyers are very aware that potentially the organization will be sued in the future, and that shapes the incident response. Now, of course, this dichotomy is kind of somewhat artificial because in a conventional incident response plan, you may bring a lawyer in, it may even be an external lawyer. You still are concerned about litigation, but here we're trying to kind of tease apart the differences. Cool, so a very real question, very fair question that you might ask me now is, okay, so you've described this model of incident response, but yeah, is it important? Is it prevalent? And yeah, here I'm kind of pulling together a few industry statistics. So CrowdStrike report that half of their investigations are under this model of incident response. So that is where external counsel and external lawyer directs the forensic professionals. There's a company who run a market survey of firms in the cyber insurance ecosystem, and they discover, or they survey 23 law firms who collectively have managed almost 5,000 breaches in 2018. And of course, here we run into the usual problem with industry reports. What is a breach? What is an incident? But I think the scale here is important. And particularly of these 5,000 breaches, of these 23 law firms, it doesn't even include all the law firms who are operating as kind of, breach coach or running incident response as a lawyer's service. So there's another firm, Baker Hostetler, who also claim to have worked over 750 incidents. This firm's useful because they publish yearly reports, and we can see that they grew from 200 incidents in 2014 to over 1,000 in 2020. And I don't have definitive evidence about this, but I suspect incident response as a lawyer's service has followed this, kind of a similar growth pattern to Baker Hostetler, but across the whole industry. Cool. So now we've kind of outlined this model of incident response, and the kind of natural next question is, why has it come to be? So client attorney privilege plays a huge role in this. So of the law firms who claim to run the most incidents, or in the past to have run the most incidents, I think of the top four, all four operate under the Breach Coach trademark. So yeah, you've probably heard me name drop this a lot. If you're speaking to people in the cyber insurance ecosystem, you basically call lawyers who help with incident response breach coaches, but potentially it's unfamiliar. So the trademark holder's blog explains that the most important thing that a breach coach does is protect client attorney privilege. And this is to do with litigation risk. So in the course of litigation, potentially the victim firm who have suffered the incident could be sued. And as part of that, the defense attorneys might use some legal mechanisms around discovery that would force the victim organization to kind of publish evidence that's relevant. So with relevance to incident response, this could be the forensics report, because potentially the people who've investigated the computer system after the incident have established that basic cyber hygiene wasn't followed, and this might have kind of, relevance to litigation. So of course, this creates litigation risk that the organization is producing evidence that may be used against them. So one thing that breach coaches offer is that they can claim before court that that forensics report was protected by client attorney privilege. It was produced in the communications between a client and an attorney. And US law recognizes that this is a valid reason to not publish that evidence. So here we see that one of the most important things that breach coaches are doing is mitigating litigation risk. So the second reason that the breach coach model or incident response as a lawyer's service is kind of increasing in popularity is related to cyber insurers. So there's this survey that I spoke about before, and we ran a kind of secondary analysis of this, but essentially there's a really strong relationship. The lawyers who have more relationships with cyber insurance providers also run the most cases, the most incidents. So yeah, we see this relationship. The more you know the cyber insurance people, the more work you seem to have. So this was the point, if you recall to the motivation slide, Pierre was raising this problem of insurers gatekeeping work. So we have kind of anecdotal evidence that this is going on. But then what I really wanted to understand was, how do they do this? How do insurers, because this is actually quite a big problem, how do insurers force a victim firm? Wow, okay, so this language is quite strong, but how do insurers shape which firm the victim uses? And this is a common problem. So if for the kind of car drivers among us, we have auto insurance, and parts of the auto insurance policy might be that going to a mechanic is covered by insurance. And we kind of know in most auto insurance policies, we can't go to any mechanic. The insurer says there is this list of mechanics who you are authorized to use, otherwise we won't indemnify your payment. So insurers, cyber insurers do exactly the same thing. It's not particularly surprising, but the cyber insurance policy will say it explicitly covers vendors on the panel. So this is a list of firms that the insurer builds who they're willing to indemnify. And there are additional ways to get your incident response firm onto this panel. So for instance, this is the conventional route. So this panel, this list of vendors applies to all of the cyber insurers' customers. So if you as a vendor get your name on this panel, then potentially you can work for all of the customers. So this is a very valuable business opportunity. And what we kind of actually find is that firms are investing a lot of resources into building relationships with insurers to be put onto these panels. But there is an alternative way, which I think is important to flag ahead of time. So if you already have a relationship with the policyholder, so perhaps you've worked together on past incidents, you can ask the policyholder to request that you are written into their policy. So this way, the insurer will still possibly subject to further conditions, but the insurer will still indemnify your services. So all hope is not lost. Just make sure you speak to your clients so that they ensure that you are written into their policy. But importantly here, you would only be written into their policy. So one thing we can study is we can just look to these panels and try to understand who is on the panels. Which firms or insurers saying that after an incident, you can use these firms. So we see that here, so the firms at the bottom are the biggest cyber insurers, they sell the most insurance. And then as we go up, they kind of fall down in the rankings. So for instance, Chubb are saying that on their panel, there are 11 forensics firms. AXA is 10. So here we see how insurers are gatekeeping work. The work, or the majority of the work, is going to the firms on the panel, and actually that's quite a small number of the kind of potential number of incident response firms out there. But then there's a secondary aspect to this, and this is where breach coaches come in. So right now, probably you're banging your drum, cyber insurers are the problem. But what happens in reality is the victim firm gets told, if you have an incident, you should call this hotline operator. And most often in the US, the hotline operator is an external counsel, a breach coach, a law firm. And they do that because it helps with litigation risk, it helps to claim client attorney privilege. But what this means is that the breach coach can actually recommend to the victim firm which forensics provider to hire. So this is where I think I would qualify Pierre's kind of initial tweet, because actually it's not just that cyber insurers are gatekeeping work, it's also that breach coaches have a huge influence. And yeah, right now we're talking about incident response, potentially technical incident response, but this also impacts which public relations firms are hired and which notification and credit monitoring firms are hired. And it also affects relationships with law enforcement and regulators. So yeah, to kind of summarize this, insurers ensure work goes to lawyers and the forensics firms that they favor by building this panel of firms, and the breach hotline operator triages by recommending specific firms. And that hotline operator tends to be an external law firm in the US. And also to get onto the panel, perhaps we missed this, providers must commit to contractual terms. So for instance, this tends to be things like an hourly rate for complex investigations. And even for certain investigations, you have to commit to a fixed price. So for a business email compromise, it might cost $2,000. And most people in the industry will say that these rates tend to be lower than both for a given firm, their rate that they give to insurers tends to be lower, around 30% based on my data. And also the firms who kind of put onto these shortlists tend to charge lower rates. Okay, I'm just being conscious of time. So yeah, we don't need to labor this, but essentially when the contract is being negotiated, we see a similar thing. Insurers have ultimate approval, and a lot of aspects of the negotiation has happened way back in time when the panel was being built. We also have this weird aspect where there's kind of these nested contracts. So it's not a clean cut, there's no clean cut way of describing this, but often what happens is that the breach coach will actually hire the vendor. So they will write up the contract, sign it. And then often another curious thing about this ecosystem is there can be further subcontracting. So often the negotiation with a ransomware provider will also be subcontracted, and sometimes even ransomware payment. Okay, so I'm super conscious of time. I think this is an important one because it speaks to, so far we've shown that insurers kind of control which IR firm is chosen. But there's this question, how do insurers evaluate the quality of the work, whether things are going well? And again, what we see is that breach coaches are in the middle of this. So the vendor is asked to kind of report to external counsel, often informal, based on the investigation, and then it's external counsel who feed back to insurers. And this becomes even more confusing with reports. So following a forensic investigation, it's often expected that there's a formal report documenting what happened. Now, most vendors I spoke to said they are less likely to write that report if they are reporting to an external counsel. Because, as you can imagine, if this report is written, then yeah, it creates litigation risk because it could be discovered, it could be brought up in court. And then also, when you speak to insurers, what you find is that, for instance, I spoke to one major US insurer who said they saw less than 10% of the forensics reports about the incidents for which they paid a claim out. So often they are paying thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands, millions even of dollars in a claim and not seeing the forensic report, understanding what the root cause was. So again, we see external counsel at the center of things. Okay, and often that forensics reports, there was an interesting anecdote I had from one investigator who said that they would share spreadsheets that kind of explain which information the lawyer or the law firm is interested in getting, and those would be tailored to the law firm or even the lawyer. Yeah, so this is just showing how central law firms are to incident response in this model, in this ecosystem. Cool, so there's not so long left of the talk, so I'll begin to kind of probe the forward-looking things. So this slide, understanding the graph exactly isn't so important, but essentially what we see is on the left-hand side, there is a large majority of firms who have just one relationship with one insurer. And then as you go up, you find actually, so here the data points around 19 show that there are 3 firms, 1 legal and 2 communications firms, who have 19 relationships with the insurers of the 24 we saw. So yeah, we can map this differently, showing the specific firms. So maybe you have worked with some of these firms in the past, but for instance, Mullen Coughlin, they have been listed by 80% of the insurers in our sample. And they would claim, for instance, that they are running over 1,000. I think they claim recently to be running thousands of cases every year, incidents, sorry. Yeah, and you see some of the other firms. So these 4 firms, Lewis Brisbois, McDonald Hopkins, and Baker Hostetler, they all run under the Breach Coach trademark. You can also see which forensics firms are kind of favored here. So a lot of these firms are new, they kind of emerged in the last 10 years, and a lot of it is linked to cyber insurance. So one of the firms with among the most listings said that their real breakthrough as a forensics firm was they were added to a cyber insurance panel in the early years, maybe 8 years ago, and then they just blew up in kind of size and the number of incidents they were running. And what you will also notice is the firms who you would associate with having kind of network monitoring products like CrowdStrike, FireEye, Verizon, they actually have among the kind of, they're not so well represented in this. And this reflects a reality that many of these firms in the cyber insurance breach coach world of incident response are responding without having pre-existing network capture technology. So they have to rely on the logs that were in place by the that were ran by the client. So they're moving in unfamiliar environments. So yeah, these are all considerations to have. Yeah, so this is just kind of a short summary. I think point 3 is probably important, which is that in this ecosystem, there's this feeling that there's always a firm offering a lower price. And this is really a downward pressure on prices. And some of these firms are venture capital firms running at a loss. So it's a very competitive ecosystem and people are competing on price. Okay, so these are the things that are really difficult to analyze as a researcher. So if you have ideas on how to analyze these things, I would love it if you got in touch. But right now we can kind of only point to industry reports that provide, clues about what's happening with the quality of incident response. Because I'm sure even just the concept of measuring the quality of incident response could produce an entire workshop. But what we can see is, for instance, Baker Hostetler report that investigation costs are falling year on year. But they also report that in the process of doing that, forensics firms are moving towards automated triage scripts and away from kind of bespoke malware analysis. Yeah, I'm just going to skip this point. One point that I think is important is often we think about, so here there's a picture of a guy in a cheap suit, and the point that I think is important to make is that sometimes, although let me make this point well. Although we think cheap suits are always a bad thing, often they're perfect for the purpose. So for instance, if you work a job like I do, you kind of only really have cheap suits because you're an academic going to conferences and it's not so important. But the important thing is that people have the right kind of product or service for their purpose. So if cyber insurance has created a lot of cheaper incident response, then that's great, providing those firms are responding to the right incidents. So in some sense, maybe the more expensive IR firms who have pre-existing network technology capture, perhaps that is necessary to respond to higher capability attackers. Okay, then, I mean, the other point I'd want to make that I could leave you with is this saying, it's a great saying, to the man with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I think it's pretty clear that breach coaches and external counsel see litigation risk. They are primarily interested in mitigating litigation risk, whereas some incidents are kind of unrelated to litigation risk. So for instance, ransomware is almost entirely driven by technical risk. And here we see that from 2018 to 19, there was a 1,000% increase in ransoms paid. We have some more points there. But the point I'd really like to leave you with, this is kind of the core point of the talk, is that law firms have ascended to the top of the incident response hierarchy, and they've been helped by insurers in doing so. And that creates a lot of open questions that I think the FIRST community should be addressing. How does that impact the quality of our IR? How does it change who is doing IR? And then also the question that is kind of relevant to a conference like this is how will this emerging set of actors, the forensics firms that I described, or even the breach coaches, how will they be integrated into the wider incident response community? Because very few of those firms were FIRST members. Cool. So I know it was a somewhat provocative talk, and I'm sure you have many comments. So I look forward to seeing you in the 8-bit Q questions and answers room. Thank you very much.
Daniel, thank you very much for the talk today. For those of you who do have questions for Daniel, please follow him into the work adventure. He'll be in QA room 2 in just a moment. Thank you, Daniel.
Cool.
Excellent. And we will have Barry Green is going to be joining us next, talking about DNS is under attack, the Miscreant's offensive playbook with a defensive counter. Barry, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Excellent. All righty, sir. Please take it away.
Okay, let's go ahead and share the appropriate screen. And drop in the present mode. There we go. Thank you for everyone who's joining this. Is the slide showing okay?
Yes, sir, you're good to go.
All right, very good. All right, so this is a session that is kind of topical right now because we're getting a lot of DNS attacks that are unnecessarily taking down organizations. So the whole purpose of this kind of session is to get people to pay attention to something that people don't pay attention to, because usually the domain name system is something everybody relies upon, but then neglects. It's like often an afterthought in a lot of organizations' security work. I'm going to put these up when we get over to the Q&A session in that chat area. I'll put these up there also, but I'm putting it here so it's recorded. These materials are open to people to take, cut and paste slides, use them in your presentations, because the purpose of this is to put the alert out, let everybody know that there's a threat. What is a threat? We're getting extortionist waves, and the extortionists could be related towards DDoS extortion, which we get these, cycle over, a couple of times a year. You get the new crews to start up. We also are starting to get them in ransomware crews. they are being used to actually poke at people to say, please pay me. It's the whole monetization thing that we know within the FIRST community. And DNS, if you know criminal behavior, they don't want to work too hard. So if they want to try to take down an organization with a big DOS attack, why send a big DOS attack against a whole bunch of anti-DOS defenses when they're sitting there with 2 name servers doing the minimal requirements for, you know, having your domain name service up there according to RFCs, and map it and take out both of those name servers, and then the whole organization's down. It doesn't matter how much cloud infrastructure they have and things like that. So this is kind of like the gist of the risk around here. Right now, we're primarily getting these sort of attacks via the criminal side. They're trying to monetize, but don't neglect that the nation state actors sitting there quietly waiting for when nation state actors get activated and told to do things. They know they have mapped out infrastructure. So again, and then political activists, we've seen this used in the past, you know, and then, you know, who knows whether you're a corporate sort of violation. Now, just as a reminder, this is our DNS system. DNS system is, you know, there's no such thing as like DNS, right? What we have is we have authoritative architectures, we have root architectures, we have top-level domain architectures, we have DNS resolver architectures, and in today's environment, we even have DNS architectures inside homes, right? And the way things are set up. Yep. Yes.
Not sure what that was, Barry. Please continue.
Oh, please continue. Okay, thank you. All right, so so we have these different architectures that are happening throughout, right? So so here we're going to be focusing on the authoritative infrastructure. This is the organization that controls your zones. Like in my case, Senki.org is an example, right? How do you protect that? Make sure that does not go down. So in here, what we're going to walk through is what the miscreants kind of know. This is kind of like their playbook. This is the sort of different techniques they're going to use. And we're going to do this as a shorter session. There's a longer set of slides when we point over to the materials that you can use this shorter session, slides out of this, or you can use longer sessions to help explain to your management and says, we need to pay attention to these sort of things, right? So in their playbook, one of the things that you see out there, and a lot of people neglect, is the whole spear phishing aspect of it, of going after how do you control the domain itself. If somebody wanted to go after my domain, senki.org, they can go out there and try to get my credentials to my registrar and then change everything around. We saw this 2 years ago, 2019, with the sea turtle attacks, right? They're not going away. This is kind of like a very potent area of attack. And it's interesting how organizations I work with, and they get attacked and you find out, okay, who's got the access to the registrar? And they'll look around inside the organization and they won't have that tracked. So this is really important. I'll point people to a document that was created of summarizing and the different ICANN recommendations for how to protect your access to your registrar, right? The other thing that we've seen out there is registries and registrars and the communication mechanisms between the two. The EPP part is also getting targeted. And this is something that in the ICANN environment, in the registry operations, the registrars are starting to pay attention to more, right? So this is kind of like a big brute force because it's going after a big, you know, instead of going after senki.org, they'll go after the whole .org, right? Sort of infrastructure with it. The other thing that you can get with spear phishing is if you get access and penetration into the system, you know, if somebody breaks into the system as, you know, looking for ransomware, you know, it's one of the things that they can logically do is laterally move across the organization, gain that privileged access into the hidden primary DNS, and then they are in control of the DNS at that point, right? So they have broken into the system, and you could have a ransomware event where they actually lock down that system or knock it down. So these sort of attacks will happen. The externally visible DNS name servers get attacked. And this is where if you have, oh, I have 2 data centers and 2 name servers, and you map it out there, you know, that infrastructure is vulnerable to attack because they're exposed publicly. But also, if you don't have, if you haven't put any thought into how to protect those, then those get taken out. Then you can say, okay, let's move upstream. You get a lot of different vendors to say, hey, put a firewall in front of your DNS. Okay, well, firewall will get attacked. Or here, I do access lists on the router, and the router gets attacked. When they see the name servers out in the internet, they can trace route and they can find, here are the different devices that are supporting those externally visible authoritative DNS, and those become a target of attack also. That's something that organizations kind of like neglect. Like sometimes you'll have big infrastructure instead of data center, and you think you have plenty of bandwidth for your secondary DNS, but then the path into it gets saturated volumetric attack, and it goes down too, right? So the other interesting thing that happens is you get these reflections off of valid clients. A lot of times, the miscreants will use the easy path. Like today, they use open DNS reflectors in different parts of the internet that reflect the attacks off, and it's very easy to do because we just have a tough time across the entire internet trying to close up these open resolvers, right? But the other attack vector that people would do, the miscreants, is they'll use, like inside of a service provider, they'll use all the different homes. I mean, you know, in the world of broadband, those are high bandwidth. I mean, it's interesting, homes today have equivalent of bandwidth and network technology deployed in the home equivalent to big businesses back in, you know, the late 90s, right? It's you know, that is all abusable infrastructure. So you'll get things like, for instance, a common attack vector is a pseudo-random domain attack. And a pseudo-random domain attack is a miscreant is actually reflecting zone or DNS queries off of like CPEs inside of a broadband network, right? So your DNS infrastructure is say, well, this is valid clients. Is it valid clients or not valid clients? Why is this particular home sending me, you know, 100 queries per second on DNS, right? And then you end up having a collateral because you go out there and you'll have a throttle, and the throttle will then knock down the ability of the customer, right, to do things. So then you get this complicated attack vector where to victimization with it. So when you look at it, this is kind of like the crux of our problem out there, is that there's a range of different attack vectors. The miscreants can map out the network and do it. So what we're trying to do is get people to do a wake-up call. This is kind of like an old like 7 Habits of Highly Effective Cyber Criminals. If you haven't seen it, there's a link in here. I'll share the link in the breakout Q&A part. This is something that over 20 years ago, Rob Thomas from Team Cymru and I were playing around, and we started looking at different criminal behavior patterns. And this is the monetization cycle. And the idea here is with your DNS resiliency is to make it where the bad guys have to work hard. Right now, the problem we have in the industry is they don't have to work hard to cause a lot of damage to the DNS infrastructure of an organization to do bigger damage, right? And so our goal is to go through and find ways to actually make it harder for them. Because if you make it harder for them, they'll move on to some other attack vector that's easier, right? It's kind of like what's their monetization path with it. So from a resiliency standpoint, always want to try to make things work, make the bad guys work harder. Think of what you're trying to defend against. You're not defending against packets, you're defending against the people who are pushing out the packets, right? So you know, the intent is a purpose there. So, you know, the 3 core recommended actions, you know, number 1, don't forget DNS. That our number 1 problem with DNS resiliency is people, you know, have an afterthought. It's like neglected. It's like, who's your DNS people who take care of a DNS? And then they think, and they have to think of who's actually managing their DNS systems. Right. So and the people who are managing DNS systems, they're usually jumping up and down and says, can I get resources to do things? And they go, no, we have more important things to do. And then you get an attack, they hit the DNS, and then everybody complains that the DNS person didn't do anything. That's a situation we just need to get out of. That's the number 1 problem with DNS resiliency is it's an afterthought, and the people who are doing it are not getting the help they need to do. Right. So the periodic review, look at what you have, make sure you have all the passwords, infrastructure, things like that. Number 2 is turn your DNS into a good on the resolver side, turn it into a security tool. This is a different talk to go into there, but one of the most effective tools for helping to protect not only your organization, but also keep an eye on what sort of miscreant activities could be poking at your overall DNS architecture. Resolver and authoritative is, thinking of DNS as a major element in your security topology. And the last one related with this, the days where you had, two name servers inside of behind a T1 connection in your data center, those are over. We live in a hybrid architecture, which is mixed with cloud and edge and different topology networks and globalization and things like that. The place in somebody like myself who's been doing this for decades, a place of putting your authoritative DNS that's exposed publicly to the internet is someplace in one of the cloud services out there. There are plenty of cloud services out there that you can actually leverage and use at your price range of what you need. You can go out there and search around for them and two bids out there and take basically your secondary DNS infrastructure and get it up onto the cloud. Because once you do that, you just made it harder for the attacker to go after your authoritative DNS. And then you take your authoritative DNS and stick it, you move that also to the cloud, depending on your organization, or you can do what a lot of organizations do. They just turn it into a hidden primary. They pack security around it, they protect it, they make sure people can't get access to the zones. If they want to do DNSSEC and things like that, they can plug, your key management system to it and they put it and protect it. That right there, makes a huge difference. Like in Q4 of 2020, we had a DDoS extortion racket going around the industry. And it's interesting as you watch their behavior, they would poke at DNS, right? So they attack it. Then they come back and try to attack it again after they move up to the cloud and they move on. They just move on to a different target. Don't work too hard, right? And so that is a major element to make sure they don't work too hard. The other aspect, if you go back to 2019 and Sea Turtle, is all the different things to make sure between you and your registrar is taken care of, right? It's amazing how, in doing reviews, and I'll get on with different organizations and say, let's do a review of your DNS authoritative infrastructure. Let's start talking about your registrar access. And they haven't done any of these stuff. It's in somebody's personal email box. Or sometimes the person who used to have the registrar access left the company. And they have to do a recovery of a registrar, which is not an easy thing to do sometimes, right? Or they have to reinstate the person who left's email address to be able to actually change the information on the registrar. Don't let that happen to you. There are guidelines that were written up in ICANN. There are good guidelines in US NIST. The problem is they were very convoluted. So what happened is a bunch of us in Akamai, we kind of like summarized everything. So we put this together as an industry white paper, and many organizations cut and paste with our permission to use this. It's kind of like a summarization of step 1, step 2, step 3, covering these sort of things. So it's a good thing to kind of look at and add to, at least once a year, if not twice a year, just kind of go through the list and make sure everything between your authoritative DNS and the registrar is following these sort of best practice checklists that are listed out by ICANN and other organizations with it. Some people would say, oh, with everything you're talking about, what about DNSSEC? What's interesting about DNSSEC is, DNSSEC was like, is it worth it or not worth it? Is it worth it? Is it not worth it over the years? What's going on right now is we move down a DNS encryption path, and we're getting the visibility to more DNS resolvers who are doing DNS sec validation. It's starting to become where it's a useful tool, right? Where actually deploying it and the cost of deploying it means you're going to get a return on the investment of deploying it. And that was the problem with DNSSEC. Is the effort going to be worth the benefits? Was always been the problem over the last decade plus of DNSSEC's existence. We're now getting to a point where it is becoming valid, good resource out there. So it's something to take care of everything else for DNS resiliency and then circle back around to DNSSEC. It's actually something to kind of look at with a different range of attacks, not on your authoritative, but on the resolver side. So that's something to pay attention to. So now, since this is related to DOS and DNS resiliency, there are some papers out here in this presentation when you download that can help you as good checklist of like, am I doing the right things to prepare for attack? Each one of these include check your DNS, right? So what's interesting there is, you know, if you go to the UK NCSC, or you go to the NIST, or you go to Australian Cybersecurity Center, or you got some of the work that I did on behalf of DDoS working groups, that you'll find that DNS is right in the middle of it, right? You, you know, these are things that when you pull down the presentation, look through them, these are good guides that help you build overall DDoS resiliency, and DNS is one of the first things you take care of with the authoritative DNS part. If you're gonna walk through, like, you got to pick the priorities ones. These are the ones I send out to organizations, do these first. Where number one is you go through like 10 steps to prepare, you know, for the pain. If you know you're going to get hit with a DOS attack, here's the things to do, priority. There's a lot of things you need to do, but here's the 10 things to do a priority. And then you have critical security conversations, because DDoS isn't protected by yourself. You know, if you're under threat of a DOS attack, it's a community response plan. Like with FIRST, it's a community response plan. So you know, those of people, everybody here who's part of the FIRST community will see these 7 critical security conversations as very normal from what we do in our community as incident responders. The materials, as I mentioned, are all public. If you can't find it, just remember senki.org. I take all my materials I present, you know, wherever I'm at, I put copies of it up there so you can find it up there. You got my email addresses on that. And then I'll put these also into the area in the Q&A section. And since I had a couple extra minutes here, I wanted to make sure people kind of understood these seven monetization factors and related to DNS. And why, you know, it's interesting to kind of circle back around to see how the 7 habits applies to authoritative DNS. You know, they can, so principle number 1, miscreants. If I'm a criminal, I want to, you know, make money for criminal activities and not get caught. That's rule number 1. If they do an attack and there's a chance of tracing back to them, to find them and put handcuffs on them, they're not going to do it. The thing with authoritative DNS is it's so easy to put like DNS reflectors, fire up a stressor or a booter and whack the authoritative infrastructure because you can find it. They don't get caught. So that's why it's a popular sort of tool in their arsenal to go after organization. They also don't have to work too hard, because if an organization hasn't done any sort of thought on DNS resiliency, or they did things like, oh, let's stick a firewall in front of it and make it easier to take out because I can do a attack against the firewall itself, then they, you know, you don't have to work too hard. It's interesting tool because we see it now with the DDoS extortion. Pay me these Bitcoins or else. Whack, you get hit with a DDoS against their DNS infrastructure, right? So they can make money off of it. So they'll follow the money. They can do it now. The Bitcoin, you know, has made monetization of criminal activities easier for them. They will move upstream. In other words, if you think that you can like have big data center resources to protect your DOS attack or stick them all behind, you know, DOS defenses, they'll move up because they can trace route into the name server and they can find out which router to tack into. So those are your couple dependencies. And of course, they'll tack from all over the internet and, you know, all the other sort of factors with it. So that is kind of like a little jest with it. I'm looking forward to Q&As that people have. Come on over with it. If you have questions also, and here's our little chat room there. So I'll be there waiting around, drop things into the chat so people can, you know, explore the different links. And then again, just contact me if you have any questions directly, because a lot of times in security space, we all know that you don't want to ask questions publicly. We go one-on-one. I'm also on the FIRST Slack, so you can find me on the FIRST Slack there and ask me questions on that one there. So I'm a little bit early, and thank you very much. So Sean, I'll hand this back over to you.
Awesome, Barry. Thank you very much. And again, Barry will be over in the QA2 room in Work Adventure. So it looked like you already had your little icon set up and your little stage ready to go. So excellent.
Indeed.
Excellent. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us today. We've had some very good talks. Please come back tomorrow. We will have more, and you can join us either through the website or through the YouTube channel. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much.